Hello, it's Chino here. If you like aggressive openings, you're in the right place. Today I'd like to look at the King's Gambit accepted and specifically the Paris attack. So after the moves e4, e5, pawn to f4, pawn takes f4, we reach the King's Gambit accepted. Now just to clarify why white plays this move, pawn to f4. The aim here is to try and get pawn to d4, so that white has a dominating position. Well, I say dominating position, has control of the center of the board. Um, but yeah, I mean, d4 wouldn't be advisable straight away because black would have this move, queen to h4 check. So white would usually go knight to f3 first to stop the queen check, intending to play d4 on the next move. However, black in one of the main lines would typically go pawn to g5 and trying to shore up the pawn on f4. Just going back one move, a popular alternative is pawn to d6, which is called Fisher's defense, but that would be the subject of another video. It's also worth pointing out that instead of pawn to d6 or g5, d5 is also possible. Okay, going back to the position we're analyzing today, pawn to g5 is the main line, and now we see this key move, pawn to h4. This is called Paris attack. I mean, the first thing to note here is pawn takes h4 would be bad because white would just continue, pawn to d4. White's going to win, the f4 pawn soon and the h4 pawn at some point. You can see these two pieces, the knight and the rook, attacking the pawn. So this would be a much better position for white. So just going back to the position after h4. What are the tries? Obviously, pawn to h6 isn't possible because black would lose a rook. So going back to the position after pawn to h4. Hence, well, I guess because of the moves we just looked at, black would typically play pawn to g4 in the main line. Now, white has to do something about this knight. There are some variations where white sacrifices the knight, but I don't think they're any good. So we'll just stick with the main line, knight to e5. Now you can see the knight's threatening to capture this pawn on g4. Just to regain material equality, because at the moment white's a pawn down. And in the main line, black would usually go knight to f6, just taking that move back. You're probably wondering why black doesn't play pawn to h5 to hold onto the g4 pawn. Well, the point here is that bishop to c4 would give white a reasonably good position. I mean, the bishop and the knight are attacking the f7 square, and black would have to play an awkward move like rook to h7 to defend the pawn, or maybe even knight to h6, which is a more popular try. But then after something like pawn to d4, we see that black would struggle to hold on to the extra material. So for example, d6 to chase the knight, knight to d3, and white's gonna regain a pawn with a slightly better position. So just going back to the position after knight to e5, so you're just seeing h5 doesn't really improve black's position compared to the main line. So yeah, in the main line, black would usually go for counter attack with knight to f6. The point is that after knight takes g4, rather than go knight takes g4, black would go knight takes e4. So what we see here is black is still up a pawn, albeit he's got double pawns on the f file. Um, so here the main line for white is pawn to d3. It's just worth pointing out that queen to e2 doesn't give black any problems at all, because black would just play queen to e7 and would be much better. So going back to the main position, after knight takes e4, instead of this move, queen to e2, white would usually go pawn to d3. And now it starts to get interesting because we have knight to g3, threatening to capture this rook on h1. But white surprisingly simply ignores it and plays bishop takes f4. And you're probably wondering, well, what's wrong with the knight capturing on h1? So yeah, let's quickly look at this. Knight takes h1 would be met by queen to e2 check, when black's got to go queen to e7. I mean, bishop to e7 wouldn't be very good because of this check. We've got a pin here, and after this, checkmate. So black can afford to do that. So just going back, so after queen to e2 check, black would usually block with the queen, but then we still have knight to f6 check, and after king to d8 we see this beautiful move, bishop takes c7 check. The king has to capture, and then we have a knight fork. So after king d8, knight takes e7, bishop takes e7. We see that white's won the black queen, although black has got quite a bit of material in return. So yeah, main line goes something like this: queen to g4, and trying to make it difficult for this knight to escape from h1. But then after d6, the bishop threatens the queen, so the queen would be forced to play something like queen to f4. Still trying to control the black squares to prevent this knight from escaping. But rook to g8 allows the knight to escape. However, white could just go knight to c3, and after knight to g3, castle queen side. Now the computers give this position as roughly equal, but I think in a practical game, I prefer to play with the white pieces because of the activity of the queen. White and black's got some weak squares on b5 and d5. This rook can come on the e file. The queen can mop up a few, weak pawns as well. But anyway, just going back to the main line. After bishop takes f4, so we see that knight takes h1 isn't particularly good for black, or at least doesn't improve his position too much. So after bishop takes f4, black in the main line plays queen to e7 check, and then bishop to e2 from white, blocking the check, and the main line is rook g8. And you're probably wondering still, is knight takes h1 still such a bad move? Well, it is, because after bishop to g5, it's difficult to recommend a good move for black in this position. Surprisingly, white's already winning and winning convincingly. So just to illustrate the difficulties in black's position, if the queen were to move away, you'll realize, well, after c3 to stop this check, queen takes b2 doesn't even help black, because after something like knight to f6 check, you see that this king is already, in a whole lot of trouble. Just to illustrate black's difficulties, I'll just give one sample line. So let's say king to d8, knight to d5 check. We see that king to e8 is impossible because of knight to c7 checkmate. And just going back, and bishop to after knight to d5, bishop to e7. Bishop takes e7, check. King to e8, bishop to a3. This queen has to do something, go somewhere. Let's say black captures the rook in the corner. Well, after bishop h5, it's almost game over. I mean, black cannot avoid queen to e2. Well, the threat is queen to e2, with checkmate to follow. I mean, black can't avoid it without losing a lot more material. So yeah, so just going back to the position after queen to e7, check, and bishop to e2. So we still see the knight takes h1 isn't so great for black because of this bishop to g5. So yeah, so in the main line, the move is rook to g8. The point being that after bishop takes g3, rook takes g4 is possible because this bishop can't capture the rook. Notice the bishop's pinned to the queen. So that's interesting nuance in the position. But yeah, in the main line, white goes bishop to f2. And now we see after rook takes g2, black appears to be a pawn ahead. But in compensation, we can see the white has more pieces developed. I mean, all white has to do now is go queen to d2, and pretty much most of white pieces are developed, whereas black still has to get the rook and the two bishops out. So yeah, I think just to illustrate that this position still okay for white despite the pawn the pawn deficiency. And we're going to look at a game between H. Sherwood and R. Sherwood in 2018. This one was an email game. And the game continued pawn to d5. So trying to develop this bishop on the queen side. Queen to d2, trying to complete, white's development. And then now c6. Just trying to solidify that pawn in the center. White was also obviously contemplating doing something with the king, perhaps looking at trying to castle queenside, so played bishop to e3. But then after this bishop to g4 from black, there was a bit of a forced sequence here. Note the point here is the bishop on e2 is pinned. This bishop can't move away, otherwise that queen would be toast. So white found a clever move, king to f1. The point being the king's threatening to capture the rook. In the game, the rook, black gave up the exchange with rook takes e2, but I mean, rook g3 wouldn't have helped too much because of this move, bishop to g5. When if, for example, black were to play something here, that's like f6, king to f2, would win the rook anyway. So just going back to that position after king to f1. So instead of going rook g3 and seeing that variation of bishop to g5, black just gave up the exchange. The rook takes e2, knight takes e2. And now we see it's white who's up material. But I think black has some compensation because this queen, I say queen, this king is a bit loose, has a few weak squares. But let's see how this continued. So we saw knight to d7 from black, rook to e1 from white, trying to put some pressure on the king and queen on this file. But then after queen to f6, check. Just taking that back. Castle's queen side was also possible for black, but again, this move, bishop to g5, would at least maintain equality for white. We that seems to be a recurring theme. Yeah, so just going back to the position after rook to e1. Instead of castle queen side, we saw queen to f6 check, king to g1, stepping out the check, and queen takes b2. In this position, white just played bishop to d4, threatening the queen, and we saw queen to b4. It's worth noting here that obviously queen takes a2 would be a big mistake because of knight to a3 with this discovered check, and the queen's toast on a2. So yeah, so obviously black didn't want to do that. So if we just go back to the position after bishop to d4, obviously queen takes a2 wasn't advisable, so black went queen to b4. But then after bishop to c3 and queen to c5 check, they both agreed to a draw. So I think the point here was maybe after this there'd have been a repetition of moves. Yeah, so this is just a quick look at the Paris attacking the King's Gambit. But just to recap, so after the opening moves of the King's Gambit accepted, and this popular variation with g5, h4 is an interesting try for for white, when black would be forced to go something like g4, knight e5, and in the main line with knight f6, go knight takes g4, knight takes e4, d3, knight g3, and after this interesting move, bishop takes f4, we see that black doesn't really gain anything from this knight takes h1. Even if he delays it a couple of moves, say for example after queen to e7 check, bishop to e2, we see that the correct move for black here is rook to g8 because of some tactics. We saw the knight takes h1 still didn't work because of this move. So yeah, this one's one worth knowing because it could give you a few easy points in a practical game. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this one. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And see you on the next one.